Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and those of you who continue to jump on, welcome. My name is Mary Brady-Enerson. I'm the Michigan Director for Clean Water Action and Clean Water Fund. We're a national not-for-profit environmental organization that maybe our name suggests does a lot of work related to advocating for and protecting drinking water, lakes, rivers, streams, our Great Lakes, clearly here in Michigan. We've been in the state for about 30 years, but the organization has been around since the early 1970s, right around the passage of the Clean Water Act. So we have been hosting over the last number of months, since COVID and everything else, a series of town halls on a variety of different topics, and reaching out to individuals, allies, elected leaders, activists, experts on a wide range of issues to join us on these webinars to really share their expertise, their experience. So it's not just clean water people talking at our members and supporters and followers, because we certainly don't know it all. And we love to, bring people into the fold and share ideas and open up the opportunity for both our members, but these are public to whomever wants to participate, to ask questions and get answers and bring up your own ideas and thoughts too. So the topic of tonight's webinar is around water infrastructure and creating a blue-green economy as we move forward in the 21st century infrastructure issues that we have, not only here in the state, but really across the country. We are, about 20 years into this century, and unfortunately here in Michigan, we have some severely outdated water infrastructure on both the drinking water side and the, sewer, stormwater, sanitary side. One thing about infrastructure, I think I like to share with folks, for a lot of people, when they hear the word infrastructure, I think they think about bridges and roads. And that makes sense. Bridges and roads are certainly a piece of infrastructure. They're a visible piece, and they're one that if you're driving your car down the road, you feel it when you hit that pothole. When you're driving over that bridge, you kind of, these days lately, maybe a little nervous thinking, oh man, is this thing gonna hold up while I get across this? Because people know that we've had such divestment, lack of funding for infrastructure in the state. But what fewer people I find are aware of is all of the kind of the hidden infrastructure, but stuff that is incredibly important to the health of Michiganders. Things like drinking water infrastructure, lead service lines, and also the health of our Great Lakes, stormwater infrastructure, failing septic systems. All of these things in the state that are hidden underground that we don't see or think about until something catastrophic happens, till there's a Flint water crisis, until water main break happens, until the beaches close because there's so much E. coli from runoff, until a dam breaks in Midland and an entire lake washes away, and it's impacting local wetlands and folks downriver. So we have so many examples of water infrastructure issues in this state. I've only just named a few, but there are so many more. And it's something that we at Clean Water think about a lot, not only from the perspective of wanting to protect public health, but also creating green jobs, creating good paying, sustainable jobs for Michiganders that are both good for the economy and good for the environment. Things that will protect, in the long term, public health by making sure that children aren't ingesting lead, but also making sure that our tourism economy is strong because our Great Lakes are swimmable and fishable, and people still want to come here and boat and kayak and do all the things that our natural resources here in the state provide us. So, that's, just something I think is important to share, because I will often talk to people who I would assume kind of get that idea around water infrastructure. And you say infrastructure, politicians love to talk about infrastructure. It's one of those things, you will hear in every stump speech anywhere. And they often, leave out water infrastructure, the stuff that you can't see. but something that, you know, for someone like a Nayyirah Shariff, man, she lives and breathes this stuff. She thinks about it all day and night. She dreams about it. She has nightmares about it. You know, it's important stuff, and it impacts all of us in the state, all across the state. Different forms of infrastructure divestment impact different people, different communities, but ultimately it impacts everyone in the state of Michigan. So I'm gonna kick it over now. I want everyone to take just a couple minutes and introduce yourselves. You know, kind of what brought you to this work. You know, what is kind of your focus area, and then we'll jump into our questions. So to start, I'm going to kick it over to my state rep here from the city of Lansing, House District 68, Representative Sarah Anthony.
Thank you so much, Mary. I appreciate just being invited to the conversation. And I'm also just honored to represent you at the Capitol. So thank you for being a constituent. And thanks everyone for tuning in. I couldn't agree with you more that water quality, water infrastructure definitely is often missing from the conversations in the halls of the Capitol and in boardrooms, in city halls across the state, across the country. You know, environmental issues and issues that impact people's quality of life and health have been something I've been fighting for my entire life, but particularly in my work as a community organizer and later as an elected official. Before serving as a state representative, I served as a county commissioner. And, you know, these issues were not new at that table, and they're not new now. And the one thing that I will just probably continue to hammer on is at every elected official position that I've had, I've always wanted to be at the appropriations table, whether it's serving on approach right now or serving on the finance committee for all 6 years that I served on the county commission. Because budgets are moral documents, and what you put your money into, what you decide to do with tax dollars and how you allocate resources determines how much you care about a thing. And I press elected officials at the local, at the state, at the federal level to prove to me why water, which is a human right, should not be at the top of our priority list for ensuring that our babies, our seniors, everyone, regardless of their zip code, their income, where they happen to live, that water shouldn't be at the top of our priority list. And so I've been fighting for that for a number of years, and I continue to fight for it in the Capitol. And I look forward to a really robust conversation. So thanks for having me.
Great, thank you so much. Next, I'd like my dear friend, Nayyirah Shariff. Nayyirah is a longtime activist and advocate for clean water. She is the founder and director of an organization called Flint Rising, out of Flint, you might imagine. Many of you probably know her. She is everywhere all the time. So I'm going to let her share a little bit about her background with you.
Peace, everyone, and thank you, Clean Water, for inviting me to this space, the space I feel like I speak about morning, noon, and night. I'm the director of Flint Rising, and I really got into the fight for clean, safe, affordable water because I was fighting for democracy. The city of Flint was one of the communities that had their democracy usurped under Michigan's heinous emergency manager law. And the Flint water crisis happened because we lost democracy. We did not have local democracy. And I would say just how I even got into like even that work was I spent just about my entire adult life centering marginalized people and making sure that there were spaces created for their voices to be heard, because I believe that, you know, I don't have to speak for anyone. Like everyone has like their own way that they can communicate, and they can communicate the way that they want to communicate, but we need to create spaces where they can share their own experiences, and we need to value the experiences that are being shared. And just working like around a bunch of different like justice issues, like racial justice. I was a racial justice trainer. I was a software engineer. I was a tutor, you know, hustled like teaching crafts, but just figuring out ways for folks to express themselves, like however in whichever platform like they needed to express their voices. And I continue to center the voices of Flint residents as we are moving, you know, going 6 years into the water crisis.
Thanks so much, Nayyirah. Thanks for joining us. And last but certainly not least is Elaine Isely. She is the water director with West Michigan Environmental Action Council out of Grand Rapids. Welcome, Elaine.
Yes, good evening, everyone. So I kind of came to this work a little bit differently. I was practicing law for several years in the public sector. I worked at Legal Aid of Western Michigan and Migrant Legal Aid. And I kind of started to worry that I was losing my edge, and I wanted to not misrepresent the people. So I started looking at environmental issues in a different way. And Grand Valley State University was starting up a new master's program in that field. And so I went back to school and I started all over again. I got my master's degree in biology and started doing water resource policy work. So I've spent time at the Great Lakes Commission in Ann Arbor, working on the Great Lakes Regional Collaboration, which is the predecessor for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which funds a lot of infrastructure and restoration projects throughout the Great Lakes Basin. I went back to Grand Valley after that, and I worked at their Water Resources Institute on additional policy issues, and that was really where I started working on green infrastructure, which that's a very wonky word or phrase that talks about how we let stormwater soak into the ground where it falls. But I have spent the last years at the West Michigan Environmental Action Council, and we spend a lot of time working with an action council's role is to teach people how they can make change. And most of the work that I do is working at the policymaker level. So I work with the city of Grand Rapids in making sure that their policies and the way they implement their stormwater management practices focus on the environmental impacts of what they're doing. And so I'm also sort of shifting that role in addition, so starting all over maybe once again, but I'm also currently running as the drain commissioner for Kent County. So maybe we'll actually have a drain commissioner here in a few months that actually is qualified to do the job. So that's it for me, but it means I'm the water geek. So that's me, I'm the geek of the panel.
Appreciate Elaine. The first time I met Elaine, I went to meet with her to talk about working with the Kent County Health Department to update their countywide septic ordinance. And much like Elaine, you will find very few people in the state who get as excited talking about septic tanks and septic codes as me and Elaine do. But we really hit it off because we were like, oh yeah, let's do this thing. So certainly appreciate that, Elaine, and we've, you know, grown to work on many things since then, but, and they still need to update to an even stronger septic code, but we can talk about that a little bit later on.
Yes.
All right, well, let's start on the kind of the drinking water side of things. Nayyirah, you had mentioned, you know, the work you've done in Flint. You know, you are currently the director of Flint Rising, which has been working in response to the Flint water crisis. Would love to have you share a little bit more about your organization, what you guys do and are advocating for. I'd also love for you to answer the question that I still far too often get in way too many Facebook fights about. Is Flint fixed? Because I still get a lot of people that I'm fighting with on Facebook all the time, trying to correct them in their thinking about that topic. So I'll let you take it away.
Well, I guess I will start with the simplest, which is no, Flint is not fixed. And I guess like when people say like, is Flint fixed? It's like, well, how do you define fixed? Is it just the physicality of replacing lead service lines? then the answer is no. Like, all the lead service lines have not been replaced. Is it like, has there been damages awarded? Then the answer is no. Like, are people still sick and dealing with the long-term impacts of drinking poisoned water for 15 months? We're still dealing with that, and that's gonna be like a lifelong struggle as people are getting sicker and sicker. But I was one of the co-founders of Flint Rising, really after the emergency declarations at the state level and federal level. And we saw that very quickly that the response was really still like racist and half-hearted. And there was like a lot of misinformation, kind of like what's happening now with the current pandemic. There's a lot of misinformation going around, and people did not know who to trust. And, you know, like, there were a whole bunch of random stuff being posted on Facebook. And it really began, Flint Rising really began with a canvas to the Spanish speaking community, because that population did not know that there was a crisis, and they only found out when the Flint water crisis became international news, and they heard it on Telemundo and Univision, and their families were calling from their countries of origin to let them know. The state did not have any materials or documents in any language other than English, so we basically did like a clarion call. Hey, if you know how to speak Spanish, we need to go like saturate like these neighborhoods. And then quickly realizing that basically everyone did not know, did not like have the resources, were still like boiling the water. And it was just like extremely like chaotic. And out of that chaos, we felt like we needed to have a platform to build like long-term advocacy and justice and reparations for Flint residents. And after, you know, 5 years of 4 years, 5 years of dragging our like lead poisoned bodies all over the country and all over the world, like, not a lot has changed in the lives of Flint residents. We're still dealing with unaffordable water. Even though people may have had like replaced lead service lines, and everyone has not had a lead service line replaced, the water mains are still compromised, and their internal plumbing is also still compromised, because the caustic water destroyed all of it. And so like, when we talk about like drinking water infrastructure, like we may just fixate on lead service lines, or maybe just water mains and lead service lines, but it's everything. You know, like, if we think of stuff as a system, like your heart is not just your heart, like it's part of a whole system. And that system like works with your body. And that's the same of like with drinking water. Like, that's a piece, like a lead service line is a piece. And we do have a replacement program because the NRDC sued the state, and we have a settlement agreement, and we used a lot of advocacy to change the lead service, the lead and copper rule at the state level, and we were involved with that particular process. But really what we need is health-based standards, you know, and that's something that we do not have. And like, thinking of like lead as exposure level as a certain number, it's basically thinking of it as like, am I going to die tomorrow, or am I going to die next week? Like, you're still going to die. And so we need to kind of rethink those standards and reframe them, so we can have something that's more health-based, because there is no safe level for lead.
No doubt. Well, thanks for bringing up the lead and copper rule. You know, it's something a lot of us spent a lot of time working on. And, you know, as a result of, I think, some really incredible activism and advocacy, Michigan does have the strongest lead and copper rule in the country, and yet it's still not at zero. It's, you know, it's still not a completely health-based standard. And and ours is the best. So, you know, certainly a concern there. I'd be curious to hear any of your thoughts on, you know, as it relates to a place like Flint, but certainly, you know, Detroit has an estimated 400 to 500,000 lead service lines in the ground. You know, there's hundreds of thousands of other lead service lines across the state. We have some older cities in our state that have not been updated. So the price tag there is significant. The lead and copper rule has mandated that those lead service lines be replaced over a period of time, that they be, you know, cataloged, that first of all, we find out where they all are, because we don't even know that, but that they then all be replaced. There are certainly costs associated with that. But again, I think it, you know, goes back to what Representative Anthony was saying, that, you know, a budget is a reflection of our values. And are there the dollars there and the political will there to ensure that those lead service lines get replaced, and that we're creating good jobs in order to do that? I know, Nayyirah, you have some experience in Flint because there have been some that have been replaced, and would be curious to hear any of your thoughts about, you know, how we utilize, you know, out of crisis, and you know, take it as an opportunity to not only do right moving forward, right, to ensure that people have safe drinking water, and at the same time create good paying jobs for folks all across the state that can do that work. Who wants to take that one first? Nayyirah does. She unmuted. I saw it.
I was gonna defer to the rep, but like as Rep and Anthony said, you know, like budgets are a moral document. Like it is a statement of your values, and right now, like the lead and copper rule and the lead service line replacement, in some ways, is an unfunded mandate. So it's something that there are no dollars attached, but I'm pretty sure that Rep Anthony knows more about like the whole funding infrastructure and all of that. But I mean, basically, like water systems are all on their own. Like it's basically like the Hunger Games. Like you gotta feast or famish by yourself. And like when we think of systems like that, like that's like totally insane. Like because water systems are critical infrastructure under the Patriot Act, and critical infrastructures are like things that are supposed to be integral to society. And if we don't invest in that, so it's critical enough for terrorists, but not critical enough for our livelihood and for us to survive, like that is like totally insane. Like it's just totally insane. And like the money is there, but the fact is like it's not prioritized, because like the state may not have all the money. The state has some money. They don't have all the money, but the federal government has the money. Like they have all of the money. And if it's reprioritized, that we're going to finally invest in people instead of upholding corporations and polluters and doing bailouts to anybody that has like a billionaire, you know, like on their tax statement, then we can all have clean drinking water. Like we could all have like wonderful sanitation. Like it may not be gold plated, but it will definitely not be lead. So I think that like we need to like reprioritize like what we value like as a society. And right now we don't value environment stuff anyway, unless there's a spill or anything like that. But we definitely don't value like water, and water is life. Like we cannot exist without having water. And it's a public health issue. Like it's a sanitation issue. It's all of these issues. Like we can't survive without it. And so I'm not sure why we don't, you know, like think about it. Like I will say, like a Western civilization, like think about it with the sacredness that it deserves, and ensuring that everyone has clean, safe, affordable water running out of their taps.
So yeah, I wanted to echo some of that. People don't pay attention to water issues unless there's a problem. So it's the same environmental water issues, at least from my perspective. So, and we have the same problem in the water and stormwater side. So we have many big communities are regulated and they have permits, MS4 communities, which I always have to look up. It's the municipal municipal separate stormwater system. So there's 4 S's. The MS4 program is requiring communities of a certain size to manage their stormwater. More and more of those communities are having to manage it on site. That means that there shouldn't be any runoff into the waterways. Because when stormwater goes into the waterways, it rolls over the land and it takes the pollutants with it, and it's not treated. It's not connected to the wastewater systems at all, except for in some cases where they have shared pipes, where when there's big storms, then you have a sewage overflows. So, but everything that happens on the land goes into the water. And even though we're not talking about drinking water systems, you know, for example, here in West Michigan, anything that pollutes the Grand River is going to make it down to Lake Michigan. And guess where we get our drinking water from? Lake Michigan. So, it's all connected systems. And for whatever reason, we don't prioritize it. Particularly here in the eastern half of the United States, we think water is plentiful. And a lot of people don't realize that this whole notion that our grandparents and maybe even our parents still had was, you know, dilution is the solution to pollution. Well, that's just wrong. If it's in the water, it can make us sick. So, I don't have the answer for why don't we prioritize it better. But I keep talking to anyone who will listen to talk about why it is so important. We don't want lead in our water. We don't want, you know, E. coli in our water with bacteria. We don't want algal blooms that could be toxic. We don't want things in our water. We don't want to look at things in our water when we want to recreate in our water. I mean, water is everything, particularly in a state like Michigan. We are literally surrounded by it, and it's all throughout our system. So there are so many different considerations for it, which include health, which include property damage and other things. So it's just, it gets prioritized when there's a problem, and we need to be much more preventative about that.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. And you actually jumped to the next question a little bit, because I was going to ask you about, you know, the stormwater, sanitary sewer infrastructure, green infrastructure side of water infrastructure, but you answered my question, right? All of our water is connected, and it all costs money, whether you're processing water to drink it or processing water to provide it to a home, or, you know, to process it, to discharge it into a river. It costs money, but it also is something that if you don't invest the dollars in it, it costs a heck of a lot more money to do it. It's much like healthcare, right? Prevention is cheaper. You know, maintaining a system, preventing catastrophe is a much smaller price tag than where we are, frankly, right now in Michigan, which is, you know, we've waited so long, and we continue to wait. And every year, this infrastructure degrades more and more, and the price tag, you know, the price tag becomes enormous. And I think it becomes one where it's difficult for folks in Lansing to get the bipartisan political will to tackle something that is such a big something to tackle. Because the price tag is so massive. It's one of the reasons, though, that we specifically wanted to talk about the blue-green economy portion of this, because one thing in my experience in working in Lansing is you might not be able to talk to someone about the environment, which is sad, right? But Elaine, Nayyirah, you guys know what I'm talking about. But man, you start talking to them about the jobs it could create in their district, or, you know, the way it will boost the economy. That might perk some other people's ears up. And it's something that as environmentalists, we think about often, right? Because we might know the science, we understand the the value side of it, the public health side of it. But we're not going to be out there with shovels digging this stuff up. We need skilled labor in the state to do that. And in order to, really make that investment, there need to be dollars allocated. Those values need to be reflected in the budget. So I guess, it probably makes sense to kick it over to Representative Anthony. She had said in her introduction, she sat on the Ingham County Commission for 6 years prior to being elected to the State House. And here in Ingham County, in the city of Lansing, the city that she represents the majority of, we have a municipally owned utility here, the Lansing Board of Water and Light. And LBWL a couple of years ago now, finished replacing all of the lead service lines in their service territory. And they did this without a lead and copper rule. They did this preemptively. They did this without, anyone telling them they had to. I'm curious, Rep. Anthony, because you sat on the county commission when that process was being undertaken, but that's a publicly owned utility. It's different than private water utilities, but they manage both, their drinking water and their storm and sewer side, and they've made major upgrades on that end as well. What did you see that's different between when you were on county commission between a utility like BWL and what you hear when you're walking around the Capitol in Lansing from some folks more likely than not on the other side of the aisle than you, when it comes to things about why we need to be investing in this and how we find the dollars to do it?
Sure. When you all are talking about prioritization, I think the Lansing example is one that we could take to the state capitol, which is, and just as a reminder, Lansing and the BWL started that process in 2004. And that commitment was a commitment of both time and resources. It took about 12 years and $44 million to actually make that a reality. But the thing that was different about that process, even before the lead and copper rule, is that it was a combination of leadership and public will. So the leadership came from our mayor, right? Former Mayor Virg Bonero set folks down, had stakeholders and community leaders came together and they said, we are going to do this. They didn't waver in that commitment. And sometimes in the legislature, that's what it really takes, is leadership that's going to say, we're going to dig down and make this happen. We're going to forge partnerships with the federal level. We're going to forge partnerships with the state level. We're going to make difficult decisions, but we're going to figure this out, right? Leadership counts in these decisions. The other thing was public will, right? The fact that people in Lansing, residents, right? Everyday folks, they may not have known the terminology about lead and copper. You go to Meyer and ask folks with the lead and copper ruler, they're gonna say, where's the bananas, right? Like, we don't know that terminology, but what we do know is we wanna trust the water that's coming out of our tap, right? And so they demanded in very organic and very concerted efforts of the leadership at BWL and the leadership in the city council and the city hall to say, we want this as a priority. And so I think that that's a good local example of how at the state level, with an absence of leadership and an absence of a groundswell of public will, people lifting up their voices on one accord in concert saying, this is the defining issue of our day. And I must say, this is going to be a harder sell given 2020, right? Let's make no mistake about it, right? COVID-19 has debilitated our economy, right? We are looking at, I jotted down a note, $32 billion decline in our general fund and our school aid revenue, right? So where we were doing okay as a state, now we are devastated. Now we are hanging on by a thread. And so where, Mary and other folks have been banging on the halls of power and lobbying and advocating for these issues day in and day out, it just got harder. And it's going to be harder to prove that this is still the human rights issue, right? That the water we drink, the air, all of this stuff is just as important as the other priorities that folks are fighting on. And, before I was a state representative, I served on the board of the League of Conservation Voters. And, the fact that we've been advocating for these issues you know, for years and years and trying to embed an equity lens in the environmental movement, there's work to be done. But I do think that the assumption that our Republican colleagues can also care or be passionate about these issues, I think is unfair. I just think that there's a lack of courage often on the other side of the aisle to step out, to not be labeled as one of those, you know, granola environmentalists and whatever. I don't care how we label it. I don't care, you know, what road or what path we are going to take to get there. I think that there is an opportunity to make the case for why water should still be a priority. But again, it's going to take that leadership in the legislature from both houses, from both, you know, the House and the Senate and both sides of the aisle. And it's going to take people that are literally making this the priority, the defining issue. Until both of those things happen, I fear that the budget process will not follow suit, that we will do what we always do, which is, as you already have mentioned, wait for the next crisis, wait for the green ooze, wait for the dam to burst, wait for another Flint water crisis. And I don't like to be reactive. We can do some things that actually make the case for why this is important before there is a crisis. But the leadership and the public will are going to be really that secret combination that's going to actually move the needle.
Elaine, I know, yeah, go ahead. I know you've got a lot of experience there on the west side of the state.
Yeah, I was going to say on the stormwater side, I can offer a similar example. So a lot of communities have, as I alluded to before, the combined sewers. So there are pipes that are shared between the sanitary sewer and the storm sewer. Most of the time, that's not a problem. When you have a heavy rainstorm, sometimes the sewer side backs up and then discharges into the waterways. Communities who have this, many of them are told by consent decree from the EPA that they got to fix it. If they don't have a consent decree, that just means that the EPA hasn't gotten to them yet. But the city of Grand Rapids started separating their sewers before there was a consent decree. They saw the writing on the walls and they said, we're gonna have to do this, so let's start doing this. So they started making these investments decades ago, and they have now separated their sewers. In order to preserve that investment, they're continuing to try and do more green infrastructure implementation. So green infrastructure can be things like green roofs, porous pavement, rain gardens that help the water sort of soak in closer where it falls. It can be what we call a bioswale, which is kind of a slightly modified ditch that allows the water to flow and then soak in on a broader area. So they've made these billions of dollars of investment to do this, and so they're motivated to continue in these investments. However, every time we get a new mayor or a new city manager, we have to remind them why this is important. And I just went through this. Grand Rapids has a brand new city manager. And when they started talking about environmental issues, they talked about everything but water. And I'm like, wait. So in our case, we didn't have sorry, I have a crazed cat going on behind me. So if that's not distracting anybody. But you know, we didn't have a big public outcry because again, it's one of those unseen problems. But we have a really strong group of partnerships. And I think it was Representative Anthony who mentioned partnerships. Partnerships are hugely important to getting this done. So when the city does a project, it brings in the West Michigan Environmental Action Council and the Lower Grand River Organization of Watersheds. They work with Trout Unlimited and Plaster Creek Stewards. So we have this group of organizations that are helping with that community education and trying to just make this problem not in people's faces, but just letting people know that there are things that they can do too. Because even though these are city projects we tend to be working on, we are also trying to encourage individual homeowners to be able to do their own practices. Get a rain barrel. It's not going to help a lot, but if you and all of your neighbors get one, that's going to start to make a difference. So it's that community action, but it's also at the legislative level. And I think you do need the leadership. I think that's critically important.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, you know, back to Representative Anthony's comments, you need leadership. We also need money. You know, COVID has strapped Michigan's budget for probably a few years. And that's a real thing, right? But one thing I know that has been, that I've thought a lot in the last 4 months since COVID started is when the federal government wants to, it can fund stuff. Like the federal government has money when it wants to, bail out cruise ships or whatever, they can. So, again, back to this, it seems to be a thread here, but what do we prioritize and where is the leadership and how do we work in partnership? The Blue-Green Alliance, which is an organization that, does partnerships between environmental groups and labor groups, they put out a report just a couple of weeks ago. And it's their 21st century, water infrastructure report. And, they're estimating that if the federal government put in place $105 billion investment per year for 10 years, we could upgrade all of the water infrastructure in the country and create millions of jobs doing it, good paying jobs that, helps spur the economy and other things. So, there's a similar a correlation. Some people, like to get into the conversation about private versus public water utilities. Let's talk about federal versus state funding, because the federal government has so much money that we all, pay into, right? Like it's our money. But we don't always, it seems, have the ability to move folks in DC on what are our values and how should that, that money be used in order to prioritize the things that really are important to people, like, as we've all said, making sure the water that we're drinking is safe. So I'm curious if any of you have been paying attention to the recent, legislation that has come out of Congress. Nayyirah, I'm sure you have. One of our own congresswomen here from the state, Rashida Tlaib from Detroit, as well as Congressman Kildee and Congresswoman Dingell and a few others were really active in this. But it is a pretty significant infrastructure package. And I'm curious what all of you think about how, if something like that were to pass at the federal level, how do we ensure here in Michigan that those dollars, when they make their way here, are used properly so that that money really is put toward ensuring that the Great Lakes are protected, our rivers and streams, that our infrastructure is updated on the sewer and sanitary side, but also clearly that our drinking water is protected and everyone in the state has access to clean drinking water. How do we ensure that that money gets used right?
We hold elected officials accountable to make sure that that happens, right? So, I mean, one of the reasons why I sign up for town halls like this, particularly around issues that align with my values and what I'm pushing for, is to get the word out about how important things are, right? And again, people have a lot going on, right? People have to worry about educating their kids this fall. They have to worry about filing for unemployment, where their next meal is going to come from, fixing the alignment on their car because of the other infrastructure issues. They have a lot going on, right? And so to ask regular folks to take the time to uplift their voice and hold elected officials accountable is a lift, but it is an important one. And I think that elected officials, I'm taking off my elected official hat and putting back on my activist hat, but you got to scare them, right? You have to threaten them in a sense of, if you are not representing our interests, if you are not fighting just as hard for clean water as you are all the other issues, then you don't deserve a seat at that table, right? And I think until elected officials up and down the ballot hear that message from enough of their constituents, nothing else will move them. Political interest groups are too powerful. The lobbies are too powerful. The only thing that can offset or balance that is the will of the people, is folks showing up at committee rooms, showing up in appropriations committees, writing emails, showing up at offices and saying, we're going to hold you accountable if you don't fight to ensure those federal dollars are allocated for us and specifically for the purpose that our Congress folks fought for it to be. So, I mean, that really is the secret sauce. It sounds simple, but it's hard because people have a lot going on. But I think that is really our power, because at the end of the day, we hire people. We hire the folks who serve in that state capitol. You hire me, right? And so if my votes do not reflect the interests of folks that are working day to day in our communities, then I no longer deserve a seat at that table. And I know politics is complicated. I know there's a lot of factors in place, but something as precious as water is something that we need to be holding folks accountable, right? And so I think that really is the message, is that if we are not holding people accountable, then there's no telling what will happen with those federal dollars, right? How it will be nipped away, right? How it will be reallocated for other priorities. We see it happen all the time at the state level and at the federal level. So being diligent, partnering with folks like Clean Water Action, right? Who actually are laser focused on these issues, right? Are trusted partners in this movement. Again, folks have a lot going on, so it's much easier to connect with Clean Water Action or other environmental partners than try to look it all up ourselves as individual citizens. And so that might be just a shameless plug for Clean Water Action, but I think that until we, as a collective citizenry, hold our elected officials accountable, there's no telling where those dollars will be reallocated.
I would say, like, ensuring that there is a racial equity lens in the allocation, because this legislation is super exciting because it's restoring funding for infrastructure, which has been, which the federal government has divested themselves from since the 80s. And like what's happening in cities like Flint and Detroit now, using like the current funds that are out there at the federal level, like your bond rating is being used as like whether or not you could even access the limited loans that is available now, and ensuring that they are grants and not loans is key. And also ensuring that whatever criteria that's created has a racial equity and environmental justice equity lens framework. Because like just from my experience in fighting the emergency manager law, it was very race neutral on its face, but very racist in its application. And creating that at like creating like a framework at the state level will ensure, one, that you don't have communities getting bites and bites and bites, like what happens a lot with funding, that you have basically a clique of folks that constantly get funding, and other communities, like a lot of rural communities and poor communities, don't have access to that funding because they don't have the bond rating. But ensuring that, like there is a plan, and whatever that criteria is, like that it holds up, to muster, because the legislature may have some piece of that, but a lot of those decisions are behind closed doors where there aren't elected officials. Like it's going to be behind Eagle, and the only people that we may know is Lisa Clark. And like you may not know like how that stuff is, how those applications are going to be scored, ensuring that there is transparency and there is some sort of framework, so it can actually get to and replacing the in the communities that need it and deserve it.
I can talk to that a little bit, because I've had the experience of trying to include communities of color and communities that have been traditionally ignored for some of these restoration projects, and the funding sources from the state and even at some level from the feds, even if they talk about environmental justice, they still ask for metrics about how much of an improvement you've done. And when you're looking at urban communities that don't have a lot of space, and you're looking at urban communities that you still need some education on these issues, and talking not normally, largely about the stormwater side of it, but I mean, we have to have a different message when we go in there. And we pulled together the partners to talk about this. And, you know, we had this group over here that we work with saying, well, this is what we need to do. And then the neighborhood association saying, well, no one in my neighborhood's going to listen to that. And so there's still a big disconnect between the social issues and the environmental outcomes, because a lot of these stormwater funded projects are through grants, and they're fairly restrictive as to how to get that money. And we've got some of those partners that always get the grant. And even though they're working in the right zip codes, they're not really being as inclusive as they think they are. They're just using, oh, well, we're in that zip code, so we're doing diversity and inclusion. And I'm like, no, you're not really. So yeah, I mean, part of it is holding the people accountable, and really trying to work with the bureaucracy, because yeah, if you know, this person over here is my elected leader, and they say, yes, let's fund GLRI, but then everything is being defined at the EPA by someone who is not elected or appointed, then there is a huge disconnect to how those grants are funded. And that's one of the reasons we try really, really hard to bring in the partners and to try to be creative into where we look for grants and not only look for the environmental grants. Look at the community block development grants, and we look at other grants that kind of recognize some of these issues better than the environmental ones do.
I think we need to do a whole nother webinar just on grants versus loans. Because I think the funding and financing piece of infrastructure is hugely important, and it's one that I have yet to come to a good answer on, and I've yet to hear anyone else come to a good answer on. But it's maybe one of the things that hamstrings elected leaders from moving forward on this is the inability to really kind of figure it out, because the price tag is so large for the things we're talking about. You know, and oftentimes in this day and age, people want to find like a silver bullet solution, like one thing that will just like cover the whole pie. You know, I think we could do a whole nother webinar on that, so we might have to, and invite you guys back. I can't believe the hour went by as quickly as it did. We only have a couple minutes left. So I guess I'm going to just give you each an opportunity to, you know, share any closing remarks, or, you know, make any plugs that you want or need to. And then bear with me, because I'm just going to spend about 30 seconds to let folks know about our next webinar. So Representative Anthony, you want to close us out?
Well, I just want to say thank you again for the opportunity, and my shameless plug will be for voting this year. This is going to be a critical election from the federal level down to whatever local folks are running. As we've talked about here, whether it is the federal response to these issues, or what's happening in your city councils, or what's happening in your drain commissioner race, this is going to be an important year, as it is every time we have an opportunity to lift our voices up at the ballot box, right? But I think because of the backdrop of the global health crisis, and because of the backdrop of all the issues with race relations, there's a renewed sense of urgency and also a little bit more dysfunction about what our election process is going to look like. I'm nervous about turnout in urban communities. And so if you have a voice, if you are listening to this and you live in cities like Detroit, Lansing, Grand Rapids, Flint, Saginaw, you need to not take it for granted that folks are going to go vote absentee, right? The pandemic hit these urban communities disproportionately harder. And so I think that there is a fear about going out and voting in person, but we have to re-energize folks to then vote absentee, because our lives actually depend on it. And whether it is clean drinking water or all the other issues that we're collectively fighting for, this is a paramount moment in our history, and we have to exercise our right to vote this time around. And so I'm just, again, excited to be fighting alongside Clean Water Action and alongside the folks on this panel. And I just thank you for the opportunity to always be a part of these conversations. And thank you for educating me on issues that I'm not an expert on, but I lean on organizations like this and individuals like you all to continue to ensure I'm on the right side of history as it relates to environmental issues. So thanks for the time.
Thank you. Elaine?
Yeah, I'll follow that up with just make sure you vote all the way down the ballot. So don't stop at presidential. We do need the state reps in there and the local folks. But I took a quick glance at some of the chat, the questions. I don't want to completely ignore those. I am by no means an expert in the water withdrawal tool, but I do not think that the water withdrawal tool will prevent aquifer depletion. I know that the thought process is that it would sort of help monitor that, but unless it's being used across all business areas, and it's not, I mean, like, I don't think Nestle has to be subject to the water withdrawal tool. I believe it's mostly used in the agricultural community. So I'm going to answer that one. And then since I didn't get to talk about it a lot, I do want to just do this quick little plug. We talked about blue-green jobs a little bit. There are programs, at least on the stormwater side, they're still in their infancy, but there was the Water Environment Federation does have a green infrastructure. We're wonky, I can't help that. The National Green Infrastructure Certification Program. A lot of landscapers, a lot of building contractors, a lot of road contractors were educated before we started talking about all of these greener practices. And so they kind of do things the way they've always done them. So the Water Environment Federation, or WEF, created this program where they could do this certification program to get people more up to speed on the actual building practices needed to put in porous pavement, green roofs, and those types of practices. And then we piloted it in Grand Rapids. We're trying to launch that. We did the first pilot training program last year in the middle of the snowpocalypse. And now we're trying to launch the actual classes, which were full with waiting lists until the coronavirus. So we're trying to build that community, and at least in the stormwater side of things, we see a huge value in getting people trained to implement these practices. It's an up and coming field. So there are those programs. It is hard to find funding for them. These are grant funded right now. But the more people that are interested in working with, even taking the classes through the community college, that's going to start growing that field. And so I do have hope that we will be able to move forward.
Thanks, Elaine. And Nayyirah.
I would say thank you once again for inviting me on, and make sure you vote up and down and all around your ballot. Vote for your judges, vote for your county prosecutor. If you haven't filled out the census, please do that, like right after you get off the call with us. Like, close out your window and open up and fill out your census like right now, because that is a way for funding to come to your community. But I would like to just end with, water is a human right. And when we say, like, I'm just using shorthand for water, meaning water and sanitation, because you need it all. And just like, like we have intersectionality, like I am Black, I was born in the United States, I'm gender nonconforming. Our movements are also intersectional as well, because the same system that is profiting off of unsafe drinking water and like using water for profit and not for people is the same system that's profiting off of privatized prisons. And like a lot of like this movement around police brutality, it's all the same, because it's all the same players and they're all profiting off of our pain and banking on for us to not be united. So we have to, elections is not the entire strategy. It's a tactic and a strategy for our collective liberation, where we are centered And I believe that we are going to get there. We sit on, 20% of the world's fresh drinking water. And so that means that we have a higher responsibility to ensure that we have clean, safe, affordable water, and just safe water for recreation, for drinking, for everything. And this is something that, like we just see, like this is basically an invisible crisis. And this is wonderful that Clean Water is shining light on it and making it visible, because it's something that is important. It's going to impact everyone. It's going to impact everyone in the state. And it may not be you personally, but it's going to be one of your friends. It's going to be one of your family members. So thank you for having us on.
Thank you all. Well, you guys kind of stole my plug, which is, so our next webinar 2 weeks from today, we've been doing them every other Thursday. So that's July 30th, 7 to 8 o'clock. That's the Thursday right before the primary. So mark your calendars. Our primary here is Tuesday, August 4th. The Thursday before that, on the 30th, we'll be doing our next webinar, all on voting rights and changes to Michigan's election law since 2018 and what to expect when you vote this year. And we'll have some folks from the ACLU and the Secretary of State's office, some election protection activists here to answer your questions. So please plan to join us 2 weeks from today on the 30th. And thank you all again so much for taking the time with me tonight. Hope you guys take care. And don't forget to vote.